Hi everybody, I'm Peter Laws, and welcome back to the final part of a 3-part episode of the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I've been exploring 3 very different expressions of on-screen violence, as seen in a crop of new Blu-ray releases from Arrow Video. Now, before we dive into that, remember you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, the same old stuff, Rev Peter Laws, or check out the archive of audio shows. When this used to be just a humble podcast, you can find that on SoundCloud or iTunes. Search for the Flicks the Church Forgot, or indeed read my books and magazine columns and all the other stuff if you're up for it. But for now, let's focus on tonight's episode, which is the 3rd, like I say, in a series that's trying to explore how violence can be portrayed in various ways on screen. To hear my review of the 80s comedy slasher Doom Asylum, where the violence is fun and slapstick, then check out episode 1. For my review of Italian giallo thriller The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, which features stylish and arty violence, that's episode 2. But for this final episode, we turn our attention to a different form of on-screen violence altogether, which we see in a very comprehensive new Blu-ray edition from Arrow Video. Yes, I'm talking about Wes Craven's directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. I really miss Wes Craven. I mean, genuinely. I know he made a few dodgy films here and there, but on the whole, he really was an innovative horror director with heart, who could manage to do 2 things quite brilliantly, I think. This is a rare skill. He could put out a box office smash of an idea, and he really did have a great mainstream success with many of his films. And yet he could still infuse those cinema event movies with a sense of depth and reflection. The Power of Dreams in Elm Street series, the postmodern self-referencing of the Scream movies, and also the thoughtful brutality of his directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. To call the violence in Last House on the Left as thoughtful could baffle some viewers, especially since the film was met with utter shock and revulsion when it was first released back in '72. And with good reason too. This is a horribly dark story about a couple of teenagers who are tortured, humiliated, raped and murdered by a gang of criminal degenerates, only for the girl's parents to take revenge on the killers in a brutal climax. What could possibly be thoughtful about a film like that, you might ask? Well, Last House on the Left is a million miles away from the funny slapstick of Doom Asylum, and unlike The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, there really is nothing stylish or fashionable and certainly not desirable about the carnage on screen. Instead, it presents violence here in a realistic way, as depressing and pointless, unnecessary, disturbing and ultimately lonely. Craven shows violence in its most basic form, and so we are shocked and we are disgusted by it. Wes Craven once referred to Last House on the Left as his primal scream of cinema, and I can see why he'd call it that. He may well have went on to create gory scenes of scrotal torture in The Serpent and the Rainbow, I really like that film, or the fountains of blood in Elm Street, but there's nothing quite as basic, stark and distressing about what he does in Last House on the Left. Oh, and by the way, if you want some of my further thoughts on Wes Craven, then check out my video that I did soon after he passed away. But back to Last House. What I think works so well about this film is that it feels both very modern and very old at the same time. For example, the film came out, like I say, in '72, and the previous 2 decades had pumped horror with the flavors of Hammer horror, Edgar Allan Poe films, of Roger Corman. Last House on the Left, by contrast, has no interest in exotic gothic horror. This is not the sturdy English ethical person or the Americans facing the twisted monsters of Eastern Europe. These aren't even supernatural monsters at work in this film. The setting of Last House is very much contemporary America, and the villains are contemporary Americans. George Romero, of course, did something very similar with Night of the Living Dead a few years before, where the monsters were us scratching at the door. But Last House takes an even more bleak approach and removes any big global plague causing us to turn on each other, and instead this film says something horribly banal. That sometimes humans just kill each other. Death doesn't always come from the brooding castle on the hill with clear signifiers of evil, howling wolves and crashing thunder. Sometimes evil comes from somewhere as mundane as the last house on the left of your street. And what do you tend to find at the last house on the left in any neighborhood? Not a vampire, not a werewolf, not even a serial killer. Let's be honest, you tend to find a normal, perhaps even middle-class family unit. And Craven comes along and says, this can be the mouth of hell, where violence can erupt. I think that's actually a very powerful approach to an exploitation film. And it's typical, I think, of Craven's thoughtful nature. So there's more going on, of course, than just killing in Wes Craven's film. He's questioning where badness comes from, and he's saying it can come from us today in our very own street. Now, this modern feel of Last House is made even more clearer with the music choices. It's littered with contemporary folk rock and a little bluegrass country. The music comes from David Hess, who also stars in the films as the most notorious baddie, Krug. No prizes for spotting where the inspiration for Freddy Krueger came from. That's a well-known bit of trivia. But yeah, the music helps the film feel relevant to audiences in the early 70s. And it's actually one of the earliest pioneers of using pop and songs in contemporary music in a horror film. That's not to say, of course, that never happened before. For example, Horror Hotel, also known as City of the Dead, that used jazz music in its soundtrack here and there. But Last House makes contemporary music its principal sound. Actually, contemporary music is a key feature in Last House on the Left, in the sense that the whole story starts with two girls who are on their way to a rock concert in New York's East Village. The band they want to see, of course, is called Bloodlust. Scoring marijuana on the way. This is a world away from Jonathan Harker, the well-to-do lawyer meeting his beast in the dark, forbidding mountains of Transylvania. See what I'm saying? Just imagine the audiences of Last House on the Left when it first came out. The people on the screen were also the people in the cinema seat. They were looking around at their friends. They were watching themselves up there being tortured and killed for no other reason than it was something to do. That's so horrifying. It felt real, especially for young people. One poster even said proudly, "Not recommended for persons over 30. Clever. But the ad campaign for Last House on the Left actually took another approach as well. It specifically sold this film at one point as relevant to all ages. Since the film had faced such a reaction of shock and revulsion, an ad ran that said actually the violence was so real and so relevant that it was almost doing the viewers a service. It reads, Last House on the Left relates to a problem and situation that practically every teenage girl is vulnerable to, and every parent lives in dread of. It goes on to say that violence and bestiality are not condoned in Last House on the Left. Far from it. The movie makes a plea for an end to all senseless violence and inhuman cruelty that has become so much a part of the times in which we live. We don't think any movie can go too far in making this message heard and felt. And listen to this. This fact is already borne out by the number of parents who take their daughters to see this film, says the ad. These parents regard this movie as a perfect deterrent to this type of behavior. Now, I don't know how many parents really did take their daughters to see this. I mean, I can you imagine how awkward that would be to go and watch a film as brutal as this with your parents? But anyway, the ad might feel like a clever marketing gimmick, but I do think the principle of what it's saying is actually fairly persuasive. The extreme violence of Last House on the Left is not a celebration of killing. It's not a rallying cry for murder. It is a somber and unflinching view of the reality of real violence. That's how the film works for me. Yeah, of course, there's the illicit thrill and sheer novelty of shocking images on screen, and our brains do crave sensation, and our bodies love adrenaline. It's no shock that these images get our attention. But what the film leaves you with is a distaste for violence. Because of this, I have to say that I don't really like this film. I don't enjoy watching it. I particularly find some of the sexual violence scenes of Last House on the Left difficult to watch. And that is not because I'm like a prude about sex or anything. Rather, to me, sex is this wonderful, intimate, loving act. And to see it transformed into a hateful, mocking, aggressive moment is just horrible. Though the film doesn't go quite as far, interestingly, as Wes Craven originally intended in terms of the violence and sexuality of it, he wanted to originally be much more explicit. if you can imagine it to be more explicit. I've read of what was originally planned for the movie, which included scenes, necrophilia and other things that would have slid the film more into pornography at one point. In Nightmare USA, Stephen Thrower makes the point that Craven's decision to step back a bit from just how graphic the film could have been, was actually very wise, because if you turned this film into kind of hardcore pornography, the chances are Craven and Sean S. Cunningham, who made this film, may not have made their mark on Hollywood like they did. But also, the film would have slipped into becoming another sort of beast altogether. Thoreau points out that if you turn a film into a horror exploitation movie into a porn sections, it actually changes the chemistry of the brain when you're watching those moments, and it takes you out of the story. Craven instead eased back a little and struck the right balance between extreme violence and a tiny modicum of taste. That combo makes it disturbing. For example, the infamous piss your pants scene that manages to combine violence and sexual humiliation, but without doing anything pornographic. If they turned the film into full-on porn, it just wouldn't have worked in the same way. Would have become something else. As it stands, though, there's a horrible subtlety of that scene, which is what makes it so distressing. And the other scenes as well, particularly even more distressing. Personally, I think we need these types of reminders that violence is distressing. I've got no issue with the comedy violence of Doom Asylum or the glamorized violence of the Giallo films. I've made that clear in the last 2 episodes. But surely we're on dangerous ground if we say that there is no place in the media for the depiction of violence how it actually is, which is brutal and sick and pointless. It's like the guys who clambered out of the crashed helicopters in the A-Team unhurt. The motivation behind that production decision was not to offend or scare kids with real-life horror. But can you imagine the result of that if it was a media-wide policy? We need spaces in our culture for various expressions of what frightens us. I talk about that particularly in my book, The Frighteners. Violence is scary and it is depressing. Therefore, Last House on the Left is actually the most offensive of the 3 films I've looked at. It's often been described as being uncompromising. I agree. That's what makes the film more shocking than the slashes and the giallos, because it's uncompromising. But by the same time, because it doesn't compromise, it kind of makes it slightly more noble, if you know what I mean. The first half of Last House on the Left is what retains its power to shock, I think. There's something so grim and bleak about that whole bit. The parental revenge bit at the kind of the end is far less shocking, maybe a little bit contrived, because there's a logic to it. They are killing for revenge. But the thought of other people earlier in the film who just kill for something to do, that's far more disturbing. So yes, it's a very modern film in many senses, but in others it's a relentlessly old-fashioned tale, more akin to a Brothers Grimm fairy tale or even a 15th century morality play. Those allegorical dramas would throw characters into extreme situations to help teach the audience about the nature of humanity or how to be a good person. Last House on the Left feels a little bit like a morality play in that it questions the hypocrisy of well-behaved middle-class people who sneer at the criminal underclass, saying that basically all of us can be savage and relentless killers depending on the circumstances. Let's just think about this class thing for a bit more. I do think it's an important message in this film because it challenges the film challenges an inherent class prejudice that you see sometimes when people discuss media violence. People from higher class mindsets sometimes talk as if they are sufficiently cultured and intelligent enough to view violence on screen because they feel they won't be warped by it because they'll get the deep messages. Those same classes can worry that the lower classes, by contrast, lack the intelligence to see the screen violence and will therefore be unable to cope with it in a responsible way. In other words, the clever, arty Wes Craven types might indeed watch Last House and say, but actually this is artistic integrity. It's actually a retelling of Ingmar Bergman's Academy Award winner The Virgin Spring, as it says in that ad. But the great unwashed of the world will see it and will have no idea who Bergman is, and instead they'll take Last House literally, as if it's a sermon promoting the joys of murder, and will then go out and murder as a result. You see this prejudice coming through. One of the reasons the VHS age prompted so many calls of censorship was because some of the upper classes were worried that the lower classes would get these things into their life and be able to watch them over and over again and not have the braininess or the collegiate discussion to be able to recognize this as art. Instead, they would see it as instruction. Now, if you think I'm over-egging this class thing, there's a book called Horror, A Thematic History in Fiction and Film by Darrell Jones, and he offers two very telling quotes that demonstrate this class prejudice with media violence. Here's an example. The Guardian's film critic Derek Malcolm once said, "It's all very well for sophisticated, educated people like you to go to the ICA cinema and see Warhol's trash. But think of its effect on your average factory worker in Manchester." Manchester, of all places. As if that's the place where people are most likely to turn. You see the North-South prejudice there. Then listen to this. The British Board of Film Certification was one of the guys from there. I can't remember who it was, I'm afraid. One of the guys was speaking about Abel Ferrara's notorious horror driller killer. And he said, "Now and again you get clever dicks who say, this is art. This is bigger than it seems. But I think of Joe Bloggs, who's going to the Odeon on Saturday night, who's not on that wavelength. He's going along seeing it literally, and I always keep that in mind. Joe Bloggs is the majority, and film censorship is for the majority." In other words, the educated middle classes feel they can handle on-screen violence, but the general public can't, because they're simply too dumb and take things literally. It's a kind of a social Darwinism that says, well, the working class ultimately aren't civilized, or they're just one Wes Craven movie away from savagery. That's one of the things I like about being a Christian. It actually breaks into this prejudice and says, no way. We are all messed up. We are all as dysfunctional as one another, no matter what our class, no matter what our background. God loves us and values us all equally, but we are also all equally possessing of the capacity for horrendous acts, regardless of what class you are. And ironically, Last House on the Left does the same thing. It plays with these expectations of class and violence. The Collingwood family are the educated guardians who keep society stable. But Craven says, hey, what if they're as primal as everyone else, given the rights and circumstances? Because by movie's end, the demure American mum is tearing off penises with her teeth. Now, perhaps you could argue that the parents in this film have the high moral ground because they are simply retaliating for the crimes on their kids. I sympathize with that. I see where you're going. But how are we to know the background of Krug and his cronies? Who's to say they aren't retaliating? They weren't brought up in an abusive family that drove them to devalue human life so much that they assume that the most sensible choice is to take it. What I'm saying is ideas like this that make Last House on the Left such a thought-provoking film. I think Wes Craven puts those ideas in there. The film ends with the baddies dead, but also with the vengeful parents in a state of trauma and shock. It's not a happy ending. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could read this film and other like rape revenge type films as triumph of good over evil, but only if you look at those films on a purely surface, one-dimensional view. I think like in Last House on the Left, there are no winners. There is no triumph. I think most people understand that, no matter what class they're from. Even Krug and his gang feel sullied and depressed at the crime once it happens in the movie. And a famous scene where they don't celebrate the murder, but they quietly, they clean themselves in the river. Whether they're washing their sins away or just trying to get rid of evidence, that's up to you to decide. But what they certainly are not doing, it seems, is rejoicing with pride. I love how Wes Craven frames this film. It opens with a happy scene of a 1970s family life. The Collingwood family are sitting in their lounge, chilling out while the dad reads the newspaper. And when the mum asks the dad, hey, what's going on in the world? He says something like, just the same old stuff. Murder and mayhem. Hey, what's for dinner? It's like a sitcom or something. Violence is something out there. The world of the barbarians is out there, but not in here. Final scene, though, of the film, when we find ourselves back in the Collingwood home, the lounge again, and all that same old stuff, the murder and mayhem, has entered this idyllic sitcom life. And what's more, it didn't only come from the outside, it came from the inside, it came from inside them. That is the most disturbing flavor of violence of them all, perhaps because it's the most true, that human beings have the capacity for savagery depending on the circumstances. That's a scary idea. Our video have put out The Last House on the Left on a 2-disc special edition, and it comes packed with extras, both old and new. The picture quality looks good, though obviously don't be expecting too much from a low-budget movie from 1972. And the special features are good too, including a nice little one, short, but I like it, where the original locations are revisited. I always love those. I keep going on about those. But the extras are saddening too. What I mean by that is we end up seeing the great Wes Craven being interviewed in older segments where he looks so young and fresh, and you just think, why isn't this guy still around? You know, I want to see him on a special edition of Summer of Fear one day. I want to see him interviewed about Invitation to Hell. Yes, I like that film. But anyway, he's gone. That's sad. What we're left with is a package that shows the respect that this film has, which is amazing considering how horrible the film is and the controversy it provoked, and yet people could see its deeper message, as I hope you can too. Well, in closing, modern folks who are used to the extreme shock of torture porn might find all this a bit lame, I suppose, when they watch Last House. But if you're anything like me, Wes Craven's debut will leave you both disturbed and I think even feel a little violated. That might not sound like a fun night out at the cinema, but since when were movies only meant to entertain? Films can take violence and stylize it just like the giallos do, or spin it as grotesque comedy, parody, like we see in many slasher movies, but sometimes horror is at its most profound when it keeps the flavors simple and plain, presenting violence as it is, as senseless and pitiless and brutal and utterly depressing. I'm not surprised that the sensitive and intelligent Wes Craven used his directorial debut to remind us of that. Well, that's it for this 3-part edition of the Flicks the Church Forgot. Don't forget to share and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Rev Peter Laws. Find me on Facebook at Peter Laws, or my website, peterlaws.co.uk. Don't forget my macabre novels, my magazine column in the Fortune Times. Oh, and the most recent book, The Frighteners, which is why we love monsters, ghosts, death, and gore, which is about to come out in the US in September. It's already out in Britain now. But until next time, enjoy horror movies, but hey, sounds obvious, but don't be violent in real life. Thanks for listening. Don't forget the Flicks the Church Forgot.